A young millionaire marries an obese woman as a bet, and he's shocked about the outcome. A millionaire stands in an exclusive gentleman's club, his pride wounded, his ego bruised, and he's about to make a bet that will change his life forever. But here's the twist that will blow your mind. The woman he thinks he's manipulating? She's been playing chess while he's been playing checkers. She's 3 steps ahead of him, and she's about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. What starts as a cruel game of power becomes the most beautiful love story you've never heard. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why sometimes the universe has to break us completely before it can put us back together in a way that actually makes sense. Hello, beautiful souls. Before we dive into today's incredible story, I want you to do something special for me. Comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from right now. And if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button, because we're about to embark on an emotional journey that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about love, worth, and the power of seeing beyond the surface. David Morrison stood on the marble balcony of his penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like scattered diamonds on black velvet. At 28, he had everything money could buy, and nothing that actually mattered. A tech empire worth $50 million, cars that cost more than most people's houses, and a reputation for being as cold as the champagne he sipped every evening while staring at a life that felt increasingly hollow. His success story was the stuff of magazine covers. Dropped out of Harvard at 19, built his first app in his dorm room, sold it for $10 million by 21, and never looked back. By 25, he was being called the next Steve Jobs. By 27, he was so wealthy that money had lost all meaning, becoming nothing more than a way to keep score in a game he was tired of winning. His friends called him successful. His enemies called him ruthless. His therapist, in their one and only session, had called him emotionally unavailable and suggested he might be trying to fill a void with achievements. David had fired him immediately. Tonight, he was about to become something he never expected. Completely, utterly humbled by someone he thought he could control. The exclusive Apex Club buzzed with the conversations of men who had too much money and too little purpose. Crystal glasses clinked against mahogany tables. Expensive cigars created clouds of smoke that seemed to hang in the air like the weight of unfulfilled lives. These weren't just wealthy men. They were titans of industry. Politicians, old money families who had been pulling strings for generations. And in this room of powerful egos, David Morrison was still considered young, still viewed with the mixture of respect and resentment, reserved for those who had achieved too much too quickly. "You talk a big game, Morrison," Marcus Blackwood drawled from across the leather sofa, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. Marcus was old money, the kind of man who had never worked a day in his life, but somehow maintained influence through family connections and strategic cruelty. Always going on about how you're different from the rest of us, how you see people for who they really are, how looks and social status don't matter to someone as enlightened as you. David's jaw tightened, recognizing the setup but unable to resist engaging. He had built his fortune on taking calculated risks, on proving people wrong when they underestimated him. His pride, that double-edged sword that had carved his path to success, wouldn't let him back down from any challenge. "Get to the point, Marcus. The point is that when it comes down to it, you're just as shallow as the rest of us. Maybe more so because at least we're honest about our superficiality." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "You've never dated anyone who wasn't model thin, never been seen with a woman who couldn't grace a magazine cover. For all your talk about depth and character, you're as predictable as every other rich boy in this room." The conversation had drawn attention. Other club members had started listening, their own conversations dying down as they sensed the possibility of entertainment. David could feel their eyes on him, measuring, waiting to see if the golden boy would finally reveal himself to be made of the same cheap metal as everyone else. "You're wrong," David said, but the words felt hollow even to him. "Prove it." Marcus smiled the kind of smile that had probably ruined lives and toppled governments. $1 million says you won't marry someone who doesn't fit your precious standards? Someone who's significantly overweight. And not just a courthouse ceremony either. A real wedding, real vows, and you have to stay married for at least 6 months. Show us all how deep and meaningful you really are, Morrison. The room fell completely silent. Every eye was on David, waiting to see if the man who had conquered Silicon Valley would back down from a simple social challenge. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the delicious anticipation of watching someone successful be brought down to their level. His mind raced through calculations, escape routes, ways to deflect without losing face. But David Morrison hadn't become a millionaire by backing down from challenges. He had built his empire on the belief that he was smarter, more strategic, more capable than anyone who dared to doubt him. And in that moment, with all those eyes watching, his pride made the decision for him. "You're on," David said, his voice steady despite the earthquake of doubt rumbling in his chest. "But I choose who?" What David didn't know, what none of those smug faces in the Apex Club could have imagined, was that Sarah Chen had been watching him for months. Not romantically, not with any illusions about who he was or what he represented, but with the calculating precision of someone who had spent her entire life being underestimated and had turned it into her greatest weapon. Sarah wasn't just some random woman Marcus would find to humiliate David. She was the head of digital marketing for Nexus Innovations, David's biggest competitor in the sustainable technology space. She had an MBA from Stanford, a genius-level IQ, and a strategic mind that had helped her company steal 3 major contracts from David's firm in the past year. She also happened to be plus-sized in a world that constantly tried to make her invisible because of it. When Marcus had approached her 6 weeks earlier, stumbling through his proposition with the kind of arrogance that only comes from a lifetime of getting what you want, Sarah had almost laughed out loud. Did he really think she didn't know exactly who he was, what he owed her company, and why he was so desperate to find a way to humiliate David Morrison? "Let me understand this correctly," she had said, sitting across from Marcus in a coffee shop far from either of their usual circles. "You want me to essentially prostitute myself for your entertainment, to be the punchline in some elaborate joke designed to prove that David Morrison is as shallow as you believe him to be?" Marcus had at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It's not like that. It's just a social experiment. And you'd be compensated, of course." "How much?" Sarah had asked, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to understand exactly how little he valued her humanity. 50,000, plus whatever you can get out of him during the marriage. Sarah had stared at this man, this pathetic excuse for a human being who thought he could buy her dignity for the price of a luxury car, and realized she had been handed the opportunity of a lifetime. Not to take his money and play his game, but to turn the tables so completely that both Marcus and David would learn lessons they'd never forget. "I'll do it," she had said, watching Marcus's face light up with victory, "but not for your reasons, and not for your money." The first meeting was orchestrated to look accidental, but Sarah had choreographed every detail with the precision of a military operation. The coffee shop collision, the spilled drinks, David's practiced charm meeting her carefully calibrated responses. She had studied hours of video footage, analyzed his interview techniques, mapped his behavioral patterns. She knew he would lead with confidence masking uncertainty, knew he would test her intelligence while trying to appear uninterested in her appearance, knew he would simultaneously try to impress and dismiss her. What she hadn't expected was how exhausting it would be to pretend to be less than she was. "I'm sorry about your laptop," David said, dabbing at the coffee stain on her sleeve with expensive napkins. "Please let me replace it, and maybe we could grab coffee sometime, somewhere with less collision potential." Sarah had looked up at him, this beautiful, arrogant man who thought he was so clever, so strategic, so in control of every situation, and felt something unexpected stir in her chest. Not attraction, exactly, but recognition. He was just as much a performer as she was, just as careful with his words, just as determined to maintain his image at all costs. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it for reasons that had nothing to do with Marcus's plan. Their courtship was a fascinating dance of two chess masters, each convinced they were manipulating the other, neither realizing they were both following moves laid out by forces bigger than their individual strategies. David approached it like a business acquisition, researching what he thought would appeal to her, crafting a persona that balanced confidence with just enough vulnerability to seem genuine. Sarah, meanwhile, played the part of the sweet, slightly insecure woman who was flattered by the attention of a successful man. She hid her sharp wit behind soft smiles, downplayed her achievements, asked him about his work with the kind of wide-eyed interest that fed his ego, while secretly analyzing every response for weaknesses she might need to exploit later. But here's what neither of them anticipated. Sometimes the heart has its own agenda, completely separate from the mind's carefully laid plans. Their third coffee date took place at a small bookstore cafe, the kind of place that smelled like old pages and possibility. Sarah had chosen it deliberately, knowing David would be out of his element among the poets and philosophy students, hoping to see him without his usual armor of wealth and status. "I have to be honest with you, Sarah," David said, stirring his espresso with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was really stirring his thoughts. "I'm not someone who plays games or wastes time with complicated courtship rituals. I believe in being direct about what I want." Sarah looked up from her book, something thick and academic that she had brought as a prop, but found herself actually reading. "And what is it that you want, David?" "Partnership, commitment. Someone who understands that life is better when you're building something together rather than alone." The words came out smoothly, rehearsed, but Sarah caught something underneath them, something that sounded almost like longing. She studied his face, looking for tells, for cracks in his performance. What she found instead was a man who was telling the truth, even if his motivations weren't pure. He did want partnership, did crave real connection, was desperately lonely in a way that all his money and success couldn't fix. The fact that he was trying to fulfill that need through manipulation didn't make the need less real. "That sounds lonely," she said softly. "Wanting something real, but only knowing how to ask for it in strategic terms." David's espresso cup froze halfway to his lips. It was possibly the first time in years that someone had seen through his words to the emotion beneath them, and he wasn't sure whether to run or lean closer. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but his voice had lost its careful modulation. "I think you do." Sarah closed her book and leaned forward, abandoning her own performance for just a moment. "I think you're so used to every relationship being transactional that you've forgotten how to ask for what you actually need." They stared at each other across the small table, two people who had planned to use each other suddenly seeing something real and vulnerable and unexpected. The moment stretched between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they wanted to cross. Then David's phone rang, shattering the intimacy, and they both retreated back into their carefully constructed roles. But something had shifted. Some acknowledgement had passed between them that would make everything that came after infinitely more complicated. The proposal came 8 weeks later, in a restaurant so exclusive that it didn't even have a name, just an address that you had to earn the right to know. David had chosen the setting carefully, public enough to feel romantic, private enough for real conversation, expensive enough to demonstrate his serious intentions. He had the ring custom-made by a jeweler who usually only worked with European royalty. Not because he thought Sarah would be impressed by the expense, but because some part of him was beginning to realize that she deserved something extraordinary, even if she was supposed to be just a pawn in a game he was playing with Marcus. "Sarah," he said, getting down on one knee with the mechanical precision of a man following a business plan that was increasingly feeling like something else entirely. "These past 2 months have shown me what it means to connect with someone beyond surface level. You've challenged me to think differently about what partnership really means. Will you marry me?" Sarah looked down at this man, This beautiful, broken, arrogant man who thought he was using her and felt something crack open in her chest. Not love, not yet, but recognition. They were both playing parts, both hiding their true selves, both convinced they were smarter than the other person in this elaborate game. But underneath all the strategy and manipulation, something real was trying to grow. "Yes," she said, and meant it for reasons that had nothing to do with her original plan. The engagement period was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. David found himself actually enjoying Sarah's company, looking forward to their dinners together, seeking out her opinions on business decisions that had nothing to do with their arrangement. Sarah, meanwhile, was discovering that David without his audience was funnier, more vulnerable, more genuinely curious about the world than she had expected. They spent hours talking about everything except the obvious questions hanging between them. Why had she said yes so quickly? Why was he planning a wedding that was far more elaborate than their fake relationship required? Why did their conversations feel more real than most of the genuine relationships either of them had experienced? The wedding planning became its own form of revelation. David insisted on giving Sarah complete creative control, expecting her to choose something simple and inexpensive that would minimize the embarrassment he was supposed to feel. Instead, she planned an event that was both elegant and deeply personal, incorporating details that spoke to interests and values he hadn't realized she possessed. "You want to have the ceremony at the Botanical Garden?" David asked, looking over her notes. "And the reception at the Art Museum. That's actually brilliant. I wouldn't have thought of that combination." "Most people wouldn't," Sarah replied, then caught herself being too honest. "I mean, I just thought it would be nice to have something beautiful and meaningful." "No, don't do that," David said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Don't diminish your ideas to make them seem less threatening. That combination is inspired because it creates a narrative flow from natural beauty to human creativity. It's the kind of event planning that companies pay 6 figures for, and you just designed it because you understood what would create the right emotional journey for our guests." Sarah stared at him, surprised by his insight and his frustration with her self-diminishment. "You notice that?" "I notice a lot of things about you that you seem determined to hide," David said, then realized he had revealed more than he intended. They looked at each other across the wedding planning materials scattered on his dining room table, both suddenly aware that this fake relationship was developing layers of authenticity that neither had planned for. The wedding itself was a spectacle that made society pages across 3 states. David spared no expense, partly because his pride demanded perfection, and partly because some deep part of him was beginning to realize that Sarah deserved better than his original intentions. She looked radiant in a custom dress that celebrated rather than hid her curves, her confidence radiating in a way that made several of David's shallow friends question their own assumptions about beauty and worth. Marcus stood in the back of the ceremony, watching his carefully orchestrated humiliation transform into something that looked suspiciously like actual happiness. He had expected David to look uncomfortable, trapped, maybe even embarrassed. Instead, he watched the groom's face light up every time the bride smiled, saw genuine tears in David's eyes during the vow exchange, witnessed what appeared to be real emotion in what was supposed to be an elaborate performance. But it was during the reception, when David watched Sarah command the attention of every person she spoke with, when he saw heads of companies and Nobel Prize winners hanging on her every word, that he began to understand he had made a terrible miscalculation about who was really in control of this situation. "Your wife is fascinating," Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a renowned physicist and one of David's most respected acquaintances, told him as they watched Sarah explain some complex theory to a group of captivated listeners. "That insight about quantum computing applications in sustainable energy, I've never heard anyone outside my field grasp those concepts so quickly. Where did you find someone so brilliant?" David stared at his new wife, really looked at her for the first time. The way she gestured when she was excited about an idea, the way her eyes lit up when someone challenged her intellectually, the way she made everyone around her feel heard and valued. This wasn't the simple, sweet woman he thought he had chosen for his cruel bet. This was someone extraordinary, someone who was making him look like an amateur at his own game. "She found me," he said, and realized it was probably more true than he understood. The first month of marriage was a careful dance of two people trying to maintain their facades while living in increasingly close quarters. David had expected awkwardness, maybe some conflict about physical intimacy, certainly the kind of surface-level politeness that would carry them through 6 months of convenient arrangement. Instead, he found himself looking forward to their morning conversations over coffee, where Sarah would discuss everything from market trends to philosophy, with the kind of insight that made him reconsider opinions he'd held for years. He discovered that she read voraciously, often finishing 3 books a week across disciplines that ranged from behavioral economics to medieval poetry. He learned that she donated anonymously to 12 different charities, spent her weekends volunteering at a literacy center, and had once turned down a job offer from Google because she disagreed with their data privacy policies. "Why don't you talk about any of this?" David asked one evening, finding Sarah on their balcony reading a book about social economics by moonlight. "Your work, your knowledge, your opinions, they're incredible. Why do you hide all of this from the world?" Sarah looked up from her book, and for a moment David saw something raw and unguarded in her expression. "Because most people don't want to hear what a fat woman thinks about complex topics. They want me to be grateful for attention, simple to understand, easy to dismiss. It's easier to give people what they expect than to fight their assumptions every single day." The words hit David like physical blows because he recognized the truth in them. He had done exactly what she described, made exactly those assumptions, created exactly that dynamic between them. The weight of his own prejudice settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket, and for the first time in his adult life, David Morrison felt genuinely ashamed of himself. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words carried years of unacknowledged bias and genuine regret. "For what specifically?" Sarah asked, closing her book but keeping her finger in the page. "For being exactly the kind of person who made you feel like you had to hide who you are. For making assumptions about your intelligence based on your appearance. For thinking I was doing you a favor by marrying you, when the truth is I'm not worthy to tie your shoes." Sarah studied his face in the moonlight, looking for signs of manipulation or performance. What she found instead was something she had never expected to see from David Morrison: complete, vulnerable honesty. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they talked until sunrise. Really talked, without games or careful positioning or strategic pauses. Sarah told him about growing up as the smartest kid in rooms that only wanted to discuss her weight, about being passed over for promotions in favor of less qualified but more conventionally attractive colleagues, about learning to make herself small so that other people would feel comfortable around her. David told her about the loneliness of being successful in a world where every relationship felt transactional, about never being sure whether people liked him or his bank account, about the hollow feeling that came from achieving everything you thought you wanted and discovering it wasn't enough to fill the empty spaces in your soul. "Can I tell you something?" Sarah said, as the first light of dawn painted the sky pink and gold. "I knew about the bet from the beginning." David's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and suddenly every conversation they'd had, every moment of growing closeness, every feeling he'd started to develop felt suspect and potentially false. "Marcus approached me months ago. He thought he was so clever, finding the perfect way to humiliate you. He offered me money to play along, to make you fall for someone who would embarrass you in your social circle." Sarah's voice was steady, but David could hear the underlying tension. "And you agreed?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "I agreed to meet you, yes, but not for his reasons." Sarah turned to face him fully, her eyes holding his with unwavering honesty. "I agreed, because I wanted to see if the man who had built an empire on innovation and risk-taking was brave enough to look past the surface and see who I really am. I wanted to know if you were worth the effort it would take to love you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications and possibilities neither had planned for. David felt his world reorganizing itself around this new information, every assumption he'd made about their relationship crumbling and reforming into something completely different. "And your conclusion?" David asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Still gathering data," Sarah said with a smile that made David's chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Love, real love, is built in small moments and daily choices, not grand gestures and dramatic revelations. Over the following weeks, David began to notice things he had trained himself to overlook. The way Sarah's laugh could fill a room with joy and make strangers smile without knowing why. How her hand felt perfectly right in his during long walks through the city. The way she challenged him to be better, not through criticism or demands, but through her own example of living with integrity and purpose. Sarah, meanwhile, watched David slowly shed the armor he had built around his heart. She saw him struggle with his own prejudices, watched him actively work to unlearn years of conditioning about worth and value and beauty. When he stumbled, when old thoughts crept in, he didn't hide from them or make excuses. He acknowledged them, examined them, and chose differently. "I need to tell you something," David said one evening in their 4th month of marriage. They were cooking dinner together, a routine that had become sacred space for honest conversation. "When I first saw you, when Marcus first made that bet, I thought I was getting the easy option. I thought you would be grateful for my attention, simple to understand, eager to please." Sarah's knife paused on the cutting board, but she didn't look up. "I was wrong about everything," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the most complex, brilliant, challenging person I've ever met. You've made me question everything I thought I knew about myself, about what matters, about what it means to truly connect with another person. I don't deserve you, Sarah, but I want to spend the rest of my life trying to become the man who does." Sarah set down her knife and turned to face him, tears glistening in her eyes. "David, I need you to understand something. I didn't fall in love with your potential, or your growth, or the man you might become. I fell in love with you, exactly as you are right now, flaws and prejudices and all. Because I've watched you choose to be better every single day. I've seen you confront the ugly parts of yourself and decide to change not because someone forced you to, but because you realized it was right." That night, 6 months after a cruel bet had brought them together, David Morrison called Marcus and told him to keep his money. The bet was off, not because David had lost, but because he had won something infinitely more valuable than anyone's respect or approval. The second wedding happened a year later, this time planned not as a spectacle or a business arrangement, but as a celebration of two people who had found in each other the courage to be completely, authentically themselves. Sarah wore a dress she had designed herself, something that made her feel beautiful and powerful and entirely comfortable in her own skin. David wrote vows that made half the congregation cry, and the other half question their own assumptions about what love really looks like. When they kissed as husband and wife for the second time, it was with the kind of love that changes the fundamental structure of who you are, that makes you realize everything you thought you knew about yourself was just the rough draft of the person you were capable of becoming. But perhaps the most beautiful moment came during David's speech at the reception, when he looked out at a room full of friends and family and said, "A year ago, I thought I was entering into a marriage of convenience. I thought I was smarter than everyone else, more strategic, more in control. What I discovered is that love doesn't care about your plans or your prejudices or your pride. Love sees past every wall you've built and finds the person you're meant to become." Sarah didn't just agree to marry me. She saved me from a life of thinking I already knew everything worth knowing. Today, 7 years later, David and Sarah Morrison run a foundation focused on challenging beauty standards and promoting body positivity in professional environments. Their organization has changed hiring practices at over 200 companies, funded research into weight bias in healthcare, and provided scholarships for brilliant students who might otherwise be overlooked because they don't fit conventional standards of success. David credits his wife with teaching him that true success isn't measured in dollars or status symbols, but in how many people you lift up along your journey. He speaks regularly at business conferences about the hidden costs of superficial judgments and the untapped potential that exists when we learn to see people for who they really are. Sarah often speaks at conferences about the power of refusing to shrink yourself to fit other people's expectations. Sometimes, she tells audiences around the world, the best revenge against people who underestimate you is to love yourself so completely that their opinions become irrelevant. But the real magic happens when you find someone who sees your worth, not despite your differences, but because of the fullness of who you are. Their love story is proof that the most beautiful relationships are built not on shared perfection, but on mutual commitment to growth, understanding, and the courage to see beyond surface level to the extraordinary person beneath. As we reach the end of this incredible journey, I want you to remember that love has the power to transform not just individuals, but the entire world around them. David and Sarah's story reminds us that our prejudices often blind us to the most beautiful connections waiting right in front of us. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear about the transformative power of love. And don't forget to subscribe to join our community of people who believe in the power of stories to change hearts and minds. Until next time, keep believing in love, keep growing, and keep being the beautiful soul you were created to be.